July 18, 1941, 04:42 hours, western outskirts of Smolensk. Dawn had not arrived yet. The sky hung low and colorless, heavy with the promise of rain. Smoke drifted across the tree line in slow, dirty layers, clinging to the ground as if the earth itself was trying to hide. Somewhere ahead, a single artillery round thumped into the mud, distant but close enough to be felt in the chest. You can almost smell the burned oil. Captain Nikolai Astrov stood ankle-deep in churned soil, staring at what was left of a T-34 tank that no one else bothered to look at anymore. The hull was scorched. The left track had been blown half apart by a mine the previous afternoon. One road wheel was missing entirely, torn off, and lying several meters away like discarded bone. To everyone else, it was scrap. Behind him, infantry moved past without slowing. Some glanced at the tank and shook their heads. Others laughed quietly. One sergeant muttered, "Leave it, it's dead." Astrov didn't respond. Ahead of them lay the problem no one wanted to face yet. A minefield. It stretched across the low ground like an invisible wall. Anti-tank mines buried beneath soft summer earth, marked only by faint disturbances in the soil and occasional warning stakes driven in by German pioneers. Beyond it, German machine guns and Pak-36 anti-tank guns waited patiently, barrels already aligned with the only viable approach routes. The Soviet advance had stalled here since midnight. Two light tanks had tried to push through earlier. One vanished in a flash and a roar that echoed across the valley. The other reversed just in time, its crew shaken and bleeding, but alive. Since then, no one had volunteered to go first. Astrov wiped grime from his eyes and crouched beside the damaged tank. He ran his gloved hand along the frontal armor, feeling the deep gouges and spalled steel. This machine had taken hits and kept moving. It had weight, power, momentum. And suddenly, he saw it. Not as a tank, as a tool. Behind the wreck, several steel beams lay half-buried in the mud. They had once been part of a destroyed bridge, blown by retreating Soviet engineers days earlier. Twisted, ugly, irregular, useless to everyone else. Astrov stood and turned toward the nearest maintenance truck. "Bring the welding gear," he said calmly. The corporal stared at him. "Comrade Captain, for what?" Astrov didn't raise his voice. "For the tank." The corporal followed his gaze and frowned. "That thing, the track's gone. Even if we fix it, it won't last 50 meters. Astrov's eyes stayed locked on the hull. "I don't need it to last 50 meters. Within minutes, a small group had gathered. Drivers, mechanics, infantrymen killing time while waiting for orders that weren't coming. They watched as Astrov sketched lines in the dirt with a stick. Angles, widths, clearances. One lieutenant chuckled, "You're going to fix mines with that." Astrov finally looked up. His expression was flat, focused. "No, I'm going to move them." The laughter grew louder now. Someone called the idea junk engineering. Another said the Germans would appreciate the fireworks. No one formally objected. There was nothing in regulations that forbade welding scrap metal onto a disabled tank, but no one offered help either. Except one man. Senior mechanic Pavel Orlov stepped forward, already pulling off his gloves. "If you're doing this," he said, "we'll need thicker welds. Mines won't forgive mistakes." Astrov nodded once. "I know." They worked under sporadic artillery fire. Sparks burst against the gray dawn as steel met steel. The beams were welded into crude forward-facing blades, angled downward and outward from the tank's nose. Ugly, asymmetrical, heavy. Perfect. The idea was brutally simple. The blades would detonate or push mines aside before the tracks reached them. The tank would absorb the shock. The ground would break first. By 06 and 10 hours, the plow was finished. The tank looked monstrous now, misshapen, improvised, like something dragged out of a factory nightmare. German observers across the field saw it too. From their vantage point, it appeared to be exactly what they expected, a crippled Soviet wreck being dragged forward for salvage or abandoned under fire. No alarms were raised, no guns repositioned. Why would they be? Astrov climbed into the driver's hatch himself. The engine coughed once, then again, then roared to life, belching black smoke into the pale morning air. The laughter behind him stopped. Infantry began backing away. The tank lurched forward. 10 meters. 20. The first mine detonated with a violent flash beneath the blade, throwing dirt and fire skyward. The shock rocked the hull, but it kept moving. Another explosion, louder. Then another. Astrov tightened his grip. Ahead of him, the minefield was waking up. And the Germans were about to realize that the junk they ignored was now opening a door that could not be closed. 06:14 hours, same field, same grey sky. The second mine exploded harder than the first. You feel it before you hear it, a violent upward punch that rattles teeth and compresses the lungs. Inside the T-34, Captain Nikolai Astrov's vision blurred for half a second as the blast slammed through the hull. Loose tools clattered. The radio handset bounced against its mount. Dust shook loose from every seam and poured down like powder. The engine didn't stall. That alone felt impossible. Astrov kept the throttle steady, boots braced, jaw clenched. The improvised steel blades dug into the earth ahead, chewing through sod, roots, and buried wire. The tank moved not like a vehicle, but like a living thing forcing its way forward. Another detonation. Then another. Each blast was slightly off-center, throwing the tank sideways, trying to twist it off its path. Astrov corrected instinctively, hands moving without thought, left track biting, right track slipping, steel screaming against rock. Behind him, the infantry had frozen. Men who had survived weeks of retreat, bombardment, and panic now stood staring in absolute silence. No cheering, no shouting, just wide eyes and held breath as the dead tank advanced into what everyone knew was certain death. A young rifleman crossed himself. From the German side, confusion spread first, then alarm. Oberleutnant Franz Kirchler was watching through binoculars when the first explosion went off. At first, he smiled. Another Soviet tank lost to the mine belt. Routine, expected. Then the smoke cleared. And the tank was still moving. "What is it doing?" someone asked behind him. Kirchler lowered the glasses slightly, frowning. The tank's nose looked wrong, too angular, too low. Something was scraping the ground ahead of it, throwing dirt and sparks. Another mine went off. The tank did not stop. Kirchler's smile vanished. "Get the pack crews ready," he snapped. "Now." But the moment was already slipping. German doctrine assumed minefields stopped armor. That was the point. You stalled the enemy, forced them to bunch up, then killed them with anti-tank fire. It was a system, reliable, rehearsed. Astrov's tank was tearing a hole straight through it. The third explosion blew the left blade partially upward, bending the steel. Astrov felt the tank yaw hard to the right. For a terrifying second, he thought the track would catch a live mine directly. Instead, the blade struck first. A flash, a thunderclap, a geyser of dirt. The tank survived again. Inside the hull, the smell was unbearable now, burned explosive, overheated oil, scorched paint. The temperature spiked. Sweat ran into Astrov's eyes despite the cool morning. He didn't wipe it away. He couldn't afford to. 30 meters in. 40. Behind the tank, something extraordinary was happening. The ground it passed over was no longer random death. Mines had been detonated or shoved aside. The soil was churned, blackened, and torn open, but it was passable. A path. A lieutenant realized it first. "It's clearing it," he said quietly. Another officer stared, disbelief creeping into his voice. "It's clearing the minefield." Orders snapped into motion. Infantry squads began forming up behind the tank, staying well back, stepping exactly where its tracks had passed. Engineers followed, marking the corridor with white cloth and bayonets stuck into the ground. The impossible was becoming procedure. On the German line, machine guns opened fire. Tracers streaked across the field, sparking harmlessly off the tank's sloped armor. A Pak-36 fired, the round struck the turret and ricocheted away, leaving nothing but a bright scar. The tank did not turn. Astrov didn't even look. His entire world had narrowed to the ground 10 meters ahead, the vibration through the controls, the timing between detonations. Too fast, and the blade might ride up. Too slow, and the tracks would reach the mine first. Another blast. The right blade tore loose partially, dragging at an angle now. The tank lurched violently, warning lights flickered. Astrov knew the margin was shrinking. But ahead of him, through the smoke, he could see it. Clear ground. The far edge of the mine belt was close now, maybe 20 meters. German firing intensified, rounds hammering the hull. One penetrated the external fuel drum, igniting it in a sudden sheet of flame that rolled up the side of the tank. Inside, Astrov smelled burning fuel and felt heat radiate through the armor. Still, he drove. Because now, stopping meant dying for nothing. The final mine detonated directly under the damaged blade. The explosion threw the tank forward violently, slamming Astrov against the controls. For a split second, the engine screamed, then steadied. The tank rolled out of the minefield. Silence followed. A strange, stunned quiet broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and distant gunfire. Astrov eased off the throttle and brought the tank to a halt on firm ground beyond the belt. Smoke poured from the damaged front assembly. Both blades were twisted beyond recognition. The hull bore fresh scars everywhere. But the corridor was open. Behind him, Soviet infantry surged forward, pouring through the cleared path. German positions that were never meant to be engaged at close range suddenly found enemy soldiers rushing them from an angle that should not exist. Koehler watched in horror as his carefully prepared defensive line unraveled in minutes. All because of one tank. One idea. One man who refused to see a wreck as dead. Astrov opened the hatch and climbed halfway out, coughing, eyes burning. He looked back at the torn field, the advancing troops, the stunned enemy positions. He had proven the concept. But now came the consequence. Because the Germans were about to concentrate everything they had on the machine that humiliated them. And the tank was barely holding together. 0640 hours. Beyond the minefield, the landscape was a nightmare of smoke, mud, and flashing steel. The corridor carved by Captain Astrov's tank had given Soviet infantry the opening they desperately needed, but the fight was far from over. German machine guns and artillery had reoriented, converging fire on the monstrous shape at the front, the junk leading the advance. Astrov could feel every shell impact in his chest, every vibration through the hull like a hammer striking bone. Sparks flew where rounds glanced off the sloped armor. One near miss tore a piece of track off, sending the tank lurching sideways. If it tilted wrong here, one mine or another shell would be the end. Yet he pressed on, hands white on the controls, eyes locked on the far edge of the field. There was no time to falter. Men were depending on him. Behind the tank, infantry surged forward cautiously, stepping exactly where the blade-scarred earth allowed. They shouted, signaling each other, moving quickly but carefully. Engineers trailed the line, planting markers and identifying hazards for the following vehicles. Each step was a calculated risk, yet every step through the cleared path carried a silent awe. No one had believed a single damaged tank could open such a lethal, precise corridor. The Germans fired relentlessly. Oberleutnant Franz Koehler's voice rang out, shouting orders, trying to reorganize a defense. Concentrate everything on that vehicle, stop it. But artillery rounds kept overshooting or detonating too far back. The corridor's uneven, churned terrain disrupted their targeting calculations. Astrov's improvisation was not just mechanical, it was tactical genius in real time. At one critical moment, a shell exploded near the left track, twisting the damaged suspension. The tank skidded, scraping along the edge of a live mine. A sudden jolt sent Astrov sprawling briefly across the controls. He could hear the hiss of escaping fuel and the crack of metal bending. This was the moment every mechanic had feared. The tank could collapse under them, crushing him and leaving the infantry stranded. But Astrov gritted his teeth. He shifted weight carefully, easing the tank over the uneven terrain, letting momentum carry him forward while manually steering the bent blade. Time slowed, every heartbeat stretched into eternity. Another explosion, another shudder, but still, the tank kept moving. Behind him, the Soviet soldiers whispered in disbelief. One sergeant muttered, "It's impossible, it's just impossible." They saw the wreck tearing forward under fire, surviving strikes that would have destroyed any other vehicle, clearing a path through a field designed to end men, tanks, and morale alike. Then came the first German counterattack. 2 Panzer IIIs had circled, attempting to flank the T-34, firing as they advanced. But the narrow corridor Astrov had carved funneled their approach. The Soviet infantry had already poured through, setting up anti-tank rifles and Molotovs along the edges. The panzer crews hit the twisted earth and frozen debris, their advance slowed. Shots ricocheted harmlessly off Astrov's battered armor as he kept moving forward, every meter a victory. Minutes felt like hours. Smoke and flame mixed with the mud and shattered vegetation, creating an almost surreal battlefield tableau. Soldiers shouted, rifles cracked, artillery pounded, yet the T-34, a machine once considered junk, led the advance as if guided by sheer willpower. And then, just as the tank reached the far side of the minefield, the first wave of infantry crossed fully. Engineers planted markers for the following armored column. The gap in the German defenses widened. Panic began to ripple through the enemy lines. Orders shouted from command posts went unheard, delayed, or misinterpreted in the chaos. For the first time, German soldiers realized that the wreck they mocked was not just functional, it was a weapon of strategic disruption. Astrov allowed himself a brief glance back. The ground was scarred, the air thick with smoke, and the infantry pouring through was alive, moving, fighting. His tank had survived multiple blasts, machine gun fire, and enemy panic. What others had called junk had become legend in the span of 30 terrifying minutes. But the danger was not yet over. German armor and reinforcements were regrouping, moving to cut off the corridor. Astrov could hear the distant growl of approaching panzer engines. His tank groaned under the strain of damage. One more misstep could end everything. He tightened his grip. Ahead, the infantry pressed forward. Behind him, the battlefield was erupting. And somewhere in the distance, a German officer was beginning to comprehend the scale of what had just happened. 06:55 hours. The corridor carved by Astrov's battered T-34 had grown into a lifeline for the advancing Soviet forces. The mud-soaked field beyond the minebelt shimmered with early sunlight, reflecting off puddles of melted earth and spilled oil. Smoke from destroyed mines and smoldering debris still hung heavy in the air, masking the approach of German reinforcements, a fortunate veil for the soldiers moving through the corridor. Captain Astrov's hands ached from gripping the controls, his vision tunneled with exhaustion and focus. Every minor miscalculation could trigger a dormant mine, yet the tank pressed forward, the improvised blades tearing and throwing aside obstacles. Each detonation under the hull reverberated like thunder in his chest. One false move could end the breakthrough, and with it, countless lives depending on him. Behind him, the Soviet infantry poured through in waves. Riflemen and machine gunners moved cautiously but steadily, following the precise path the T-34 had forged. Engineers trailed closely, planting markers and preparing the way for following armor. The psychological impact on the German defenders was immediate. What had been a sealed, deadly barrier now appeared breached by sheer audacity. From the German observation post, Oberleutnant Franz Köhler watched, mouth agape, as the impossible unfolded. They've gone through, he muttered. His officers scrambled to reorganize, but the shock had already struck. German tactics relied on predictable obstacles. When a single tank defied logic, the entire defensive plan unraveled. Panic and disbelief spread rapidly down the line. Astrov knew the real danger had only just begun. German armor and infantry were regrouping to counterattack. He felt the vibrations of approaching panzer engines, their low growl a warning that the corridor he had opened would soon be contested. The damaged tank groaned under stress, metal screeched against bent blades, and a small plume of smoke issued from a ruptured fuel line. "Keep going," he shouted through the internal intercom to the driver assistant. They had seconds to react. One wrong maneuver could wedge the tank between live mines and enemy fire. The first German attempt to halt the advance came from a concealed Pak-36 position. A shell struck the side of the hull, bouncing off the sloped armor but tearing away part of the external plating. Sparks erupted, and the smell of scorched steel filled the cabin. Astrov didn't flinch. Every movement was calculated. He drove forward, using the twisted, jagged blades as shields against secondary blasts. Soviet infantry behind him gained momentum. They were emboldened by the spectacle. The so-called junk tank leading the way had survived multiple detonations and direct hits. Soldiers shouted encouragement, their morale soaring as the advance transformed into an unstoppable push. A German counterattack squadron tried flanking maneuvers, sending 2 Panzer IIIs along the cleared corridor. But the path Astrov had forged was narrow, forcing the enemy tanks into a bottleneck. Molotov cocktails and anti-tank rifles waited. German armor, expecting an easy chase, now found itself exposed and trapped. Explosions and smoke rose simultaneously as the engagement intensified. Astrov's mind raced. He calculated distances, weight distribution, and blast radius with near-military precision. Every meter gained was a victory, every second counted. He glanced back briefly, catching sight of the infantry advancing, unharmed so far, eyes wide with awe. In those faces, he saw the realization forming. The minefield was no longer an obstacle. It was a conquered space, a symbol of ingenuity and daring. For the Germans, the nightmare was clear. Orders were shouted, but communication lines had already been disrupted by prior artillery. The infantry struggled to regroup. Tanks that should have commanded the battlefield were now vulnerable, moving into a trap they could not anticipate. One Oberleutnant cursed, realizing that a single improvised tank had undone weeks of careful planning. Astrov's T-34, battered, smoking, and scarred, continued forward. Every blast it absorbed, every minor mechanical failure it survived, became a testament to human ingenuity and sheer courage under fire. The corridor was no longer just a path, it had become the turning point of the engagement at Smolensk. And as the tank approached the far edge of the minefield, a new, terrifying realization struck. The Germans were beginning to understand exactly what had happened, and they would not allow such a breach to remain unchallenged for long. 07:10 hours. Beyond the minefield, the battlefield had become a chaotic mosaic of mud, smoke, and clashing forces. The T-34, battered and blackened from the explosions, had cleared a path, but the Germans were not idle. A fresh wave of Panzer IIIs and infantry units converged on the corridor, determined to seal it and eliminate the monster that had dared to defy their defenses. Captain Astrov felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than the tank's own armor. Every second of hesitation could mean death for the soldiers relying on him. He could hear the staccato rattle of machine gun fire striking nearby trees, the distant hum of artillery preparing to rain destruction. Inside the hull, the smell of burnt oil mixed with powder smoke, making the air almost suffocating. Yet there was no time to breathe. Only forward mattered. A sudden impact shook the tank violently. One of the improvised blades had struck a concealed German anti-tank mine at the edge of the cleared corridor. Sparks flew, metal bent, and the hull tilted dangerously. Astrov's hands were white-knuckled on the controls. For a moment, this seemed like it might collapse entirely. But he didn't falter. Calculating the uneven terrain instinctively, he eased the tank forward, letting momentum carry it past the danger. Another blast followed immediately, this one closer. He could hear German soldiers shouting commands, their voices muffled through the hull but unmistakably panicked. The corridor, once thought impassable, had become a funnel for chaos. Behind him, infantry followed meticulously, using the scarred earth and displaced debris as cover. Engineers marked every hazard, improvising additional paths for the next waves of armor. The scene was tense, yet almost surreal, a single junk tank leading an entire army through what should have been a death trap. German officers scrambled to respond. Oberleutnant Köhler's face was pale, his prior confidence eroded by disbelief. Communications faltered, one panzer unit stalled, unsure how to navigate the twisted terrain and improvised obstacles. The audacity of the Soviet maneuver had introduced panic into a line that had relied on precision and predictability. Astrov glanced briefly at the far end of the corridor. The minefield's exit was near, but German resistance was stiffening. Machine guns erupted along the edges, tracer rounds arcing across the field, narrowly missing the advancing infantry. One miscalculation now could close the corridor forever, trapping both the tank and the soldiers following it. But they held. Every jolt, every shudder, every detonation reinforced the confidence of those behind it. Astrov's improvised machine had become more than metal and steel. It had become a symbol of courage and innovation in the face of impossible odds. And just as the first wave of infantry cleared the far side, Astrov realized the full extent of what they had achieved. A path that should have been a death trap was now a bridge to victory, forged by ingenuity, nerve, and relentless determination. Yet beyond the horizon, the Germans were rallying for one final counterattack. The next moments would decide whether the corridor remained open or if it would collapse under the weight of enemy fire. 07:25 hours. The morning sun had barely begun to pierce the lingering smoke, casting a pale light over the scarred battlefield. The cleared corridor stretched ahead like a lifeline, but danger still pressed from all sides. German armor and infantry were regrouping quickly, determined to destroy the tank that had defied logic and demolished their defenses. Captain Astrov's hands were raw, his muscles screaming with exhaustion. Every vibration through the hull reminded him of the relentless stress the tank had endured. Sparks from twisted steel flickered across the interior as the bent blades scraped uneven ground. The T-34 had become more than just a tool. It was a living, breathing weapon, balancing on the edge between genius and catastrophe. From the far side of the corridor, Soviet engineers and infantry advanced steadily. Their confidence had been bolstered by the success of the tank's path clearing. Men who had moments earlier trembled at the thought of crossing the minefield now moved with precise purpose, trusting every inch to Astrov's machine. Every step taken through the improvised path felt like defiance against the odds. But the Germans were not idle. Oberleutnant Köchler had assembled a concentrated force of Panzer IIIs, Pak-40 anti-tank guns, and infantry squads to cut off the corridor. The crack of gunfire and the rumble of engines announced their advance. Tracer rounds streaked across the open field, and shells began to impact dangerously close to the T-34. One misstep now could trap the tank and turn the corridor into a tomb. Astrov adjusted the throttle, eyes fixed ahead. The left blade, twisted and mangled from previous detonations, scraped against a partially hidden mine. The hull shuddered violently, metal groaning in protest. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Would the tank survive this final test? It did. With careful calculation and sheer instinct, Astrov guided the T-34 forward. The mine detonated, sending dirt and smoke high into the air, but the reinforced hull and improvised blades absorbed the blast. Behind him, the infantry surged forward, stepping precisely where the tracks had flattened the lethal terrain. Engineers moved fast, planting markers for the remaining armor columns to follow. The German counterattack collided with the advancing Soviet forces at the edge of the corridor. Chaos erupted. Panzer crews struggled in the narrow, uneven path. Some vehicles stalled or bogged down. Infantry units tried to flank, but were met with precise rifle fire from men who had followed Astrov's trail. Within minutes, the German formation began to crumble under the combined weight of ingenuity, courage, and momentum. Astrov's T-34 pressed on, smoke curling from its engine and splintered armor plates. The tank had survived multiple blasts, near misses, and concentrated fire. It was battered, but unstoppable. With every meter it advanced, the corridor widened, enabling more vehicles to pass and reinforcing the breakthrough. By 07:50 hours, the minefield had been conquered. Soviet forces poured through in organized waves, using the path carved by one man and his junk tank. German defenders were forced to retreat or surrender, their confidence shattered, their meticulously planned defenses rendered meaningless. Astrov climbed partially out of the hatch, surveying the battlefield. The tank's twisted blades and scarred hull stood as a testament to human ingenuity and relentless determination. Soldiers cheered silently or written across their faces, while the enemy reeled from the unexpected reversal. The breakthrough was complete, but the impact of Astrov's daring improvisation would echo far beyond this single engagement. The battlefield had been reshaped, morale restored, and a legend born, a junk tank that had turned the tide at Smolensk, one minefield at a time.